Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing stories. Today we'll delve into the shadows of the Virginia Appalachians, where the name Evelyn Carter still echoes like an icy whisper among the mist-shrouded mountains. Comment where you're watching from now. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. It was 1903. And the mountainous region of Virginia was experiencing a peculiar moment. The isolated communities nestled among the Appalachian valleys maintained ancient traditions where modernity arrived slowly, almost reluctantly. Dirt roads connected forgotten villages, and life followed a rhythm dictated by the seasons and customs inherited from past generations. At that time, the forest was more than just a landscape. It was a constant presence, a silent witness to everything that happened beneath its dense canopy. Evelyn Carter was known in the region for her skill with medicinal herbs. A middle-aged woman, she lived on a property far from the county center, surrounded by gardens that seemed to have a life of their own. Her nearest neighbors were miles away, and many sought her out when conventional medicine failed. There was something magnetic about her presence, an intensity in her gaze that some interpreted as wisdom, others as something darker. Evelyn's property sat on a discreet rise, offering a panoramic view of the entire valley during the day. At night, however, darkness swallowed everything, and only the faint glow of oil lamps indicated that someone lived there. The locals spoke of nightly gatherings held at her house, meetings about which little was openly discussed. There was a pact of silence among those who frequented the place, as if words spoken aloud could shatter something fragile and dangerous. In the autumn of that year, strange reports began to emerge. Travelers passing by the road near Evelyn's property said they heard chants in unknown languages, voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Some swore they had seen pale lights floating among the trees, moving of their own accord. The most skeptical attributed everything to illusions caused by the dense fog that covered the mountains, but those who knew the region well knew that there was something different in the air. The local newspaper, a modest publication circulating among neighboring counties, began receiving anonymous letters. They were fragmented accounts, written in trembling handwriting, describing disturbing events that had occurred near Evelyn's property. No one signed the texts, and the editor hesitated to publish them, fearing reprisals or accusations of spreading unfounded rumors. Still, the letters kept arriving, each one more unsettling than the last. Evelyn never publicly defended herself against the whispers that circulated. She continued her routine, tending to her plants, receiving visitors at specific times, maintaining a posture that bordered on silent defiance. To those who observed her from afar, she seemed oblivious to the speculation, as if she lived in a parallel reality where the opinions of others had no weight. But those who knew her closely perceived a subtle change in her behavior, a constant vigilance, as if she expected something inevitable. The community was divided. There were those who fiercely defended her, claiming she was a victim of envy and superstition. Others avoided mentioning her name, averting their gaze when someone brought up the subject. This division created a palpable tension, turning casual conversations into minefields where every word had to be carefully chosen. Sermons at the local church took on a darker tone, veiled warnings about spiritual dangers threatening the community. As winter approached, the atmosphere grew denser. The mountains seemed to close in on the valley, and the silence of the snow muffled even the most ordinary sounds. It was during this time that the true mystery began to unfold, when events impossible to ignore forced everyone to confront what had been whispered only in the shadows. The winter of 1904 brought with it a cold that seemed to penetrate not only the bodies, but also the spirits of those who lived in the Appalachian valleys. The snow fell silently, covering everything with a white blanket that transformed the landscape into something unreal, almost dreamlike. The roads became impassable for weeks, further isolating the communities that already lived far apart from one another. It was in this isolation that secrets flourished like poisonous plants. Evelyn Carter's property had become a disturbing landmark in the region. Even those who had never visited knew its exact location, as if the house exerted a magnetic pull on the collective consciousness. During the day, the property seemed ordinary, just another aged wooden structure against the mountainous landscape. But when night fell, something changed. The light emanating from the windows had a strange quality, a yellowish glow that pulsed irregularly. During those frigid months, Stories emerged about objects found in the forest surrounding the property, small structures made of intertwined branches, arranged in geometric patterns that didn't seem natural. Some hunters stumbled upon these structures and destroyed them immediately, an instinctive fear guiding their actions. Others left them untouched, fearing that tampering with them could bring unknown consequences. There was a widespread feeling that those structures served some specific purpose, although no one could explain what it was. Evelyn continued to receive visitors, even in the dead of winter. People made long treks through the deep snow to reach her door. Some came seeking remedies for illnesses afflicting their families. Others sought something different, something that could not be named aloud. Those who returned from these visits rarely spoke of what they had seen or experienced, but a change was visible in their eyes, a new and unsettling understanding of the nature of things. There was a man in the county, a blacksmith named Thomas Whitmore, who became particularly vocal about his suspicions. He claimed to have observed strange movements around Evelyn's property during his nightly walks. Thomas was known for his rational and pragmatic nature, which made his statements all the more unsettling. He didn't speak of ghosts or superstitions, but of concrete activities that defied logical explanation. His words resonated with some, while others accused him of fueling mass hysteria. The pastor of the local church, a stern man who preached about righteousness and spiritual vigilance, began to include veiled references to Evelyn in his sermons. He never mentioned her by name, but everyone understood who he was talking about when he warned against those who sought forbidden knowledge. His words created a tense atmosphere within the church, where the faithful exchanged nervous glances, each wondering what the others knew or were hiding. Tension in the community reached a critical point when personal belongings began disappearing from homes. Small things initially, items that might have simply been lost or forgotten. But the frequency of these disappearances was disturbing, and a pattern began to emerge. The objects that vanished had something in common. They all possessed some sentimental value for their owners. Old photographs, inherited jewelry, carefully kept letters. It was as if someone were collecting fragments of people's lives, piecing together fragments of their stories for some obscure purpose. Evelyn remained silent in the face of mounting accusations. She neither defended herself nor attacked her detractors. Her indifference was almost more unsettling than any vehement denial would have been. She continued her life as if nothing were happening, maintaining her daily rituals, tending to her gardens even in the snow, receiving those who sought her services. There was a defiant quality to her demeanor, as if she knew something that others had not yet grasped. The nights grew longer, and with them the stories grew. Tales of inexplicable sounds echoing through the valleys, of shadows moving against the wind, of sensations of being watched even in complete solitude. The forest surrounding Evelyn's property seemed to have acquired a consciousness of its own, as if guarding ancient secrets that now threatened to surface. And at the center of it all remained the enigmatic figure of Evelyn Carter, serene and imperturbable, waiting for events to take their natural course. Spring 1905 arrived late in the Virginia Appalachians, as if winter itself resisted relinquishing its hold on those mountains. When the snow finally began to melt, it revealed a transformed landscape, marked by months of isolation and heavy silences. The waters of the streams ran murky and swift, carrying with them fallen branches and dead leaves accumulated during the icy months. It was as if nature were purifying itself, washing away the traces of something that should not have remained there for so long. With the arrival of milder weather, the roads became passable again, and the flow of travelers through the region increased considerably. Merchants who had avoided those routes during the winter resumed their journeys, bringing with them news from other counties and stories from distant places. It was through these travelers that the isolated communities maintained some connection with the world beyond the mountains, and it was through them that new elements began to be added to the mystery surrounding Evelyn Carter and her peculiar property. One of these travelers, a fabric and tool salesman who had been roaming the region for decades, brought unsettling accounts from other locations. He spoke of similar properties in distant counties, places where solitary women lived in relative isolation, practicing crafts that blended traditional healing with something more indefinable. In his words, there was a pattern in these stories, a repetition of elements that suggested something larger than isolated cases. The communities around these properties always exhibited the same divisions, the same unspoken fears, the same strange objects found in the surrounding forests. These revelations had a profound impact on the local residents. Some saw it as confirmation of their worst suspicions, while others argued that they were merely coincidences, amplified by the fertile imagination of superstitious people. The debate intensified in taverns and community gatherings, dividing families and breaking old friendships. The issue ceased to be solely about Evelyn Carter specifically, expanding to broader questions about the nature of knowledge, power, and the limits that should or should not be respected. Evelyn, for her part, seemed oblivious to all this commotion. She expanded her gardens during the spring, planting species that no one in the region could identify. The plants grew at an abnormal speed, reaching impressive heights in a matter of weeks. Some had flowers whose colors seemed to change depending on the angle of the light, creating a disturbing visual spectacle for those who passed by the property. The aromas emanating from these gardens were intense and complex, mixing sweet fragrances with bitter notes that caused varied physical reactions in those who inhaled them. Evelyn's house also underwent visible modifications. New structures were erected around the main building, small windowless buildings that served unknown purposes. Some speculated that they were storage for her plants and medicinal preparations. Others imagined darker uses, related to practices that supposedly took place there during moonless nights. The architecture of these structures was peculiar, following proportions that defied local building conventions, as if based on some architectural knowledge from different traditions. During this period, strange markings began appearing on properties around the county, symbols carved into tree trunks, drawn with charcoal on barn walls, scratched into garden soil. No one claimed authorship of these markings, and their origin remained a frustrating mystery. The symbols did not correspond to any alphabet known to the local residents, nor did they resemble the traditional markings used by hunters or surveyors. There was a deliberate quality to their execution, a precision that suggested specific purpose and meaning. Thomas Whitmore, the blacksmith who had been vocal about his suspicions during the winter, intensified his efforts to document the strange events. He began keeping a detailed record of everything he observed or heard, noting the dates, times, and circumstances of each peculiar occurrence. His notebook became a kind of unofficial archive of the mystery surrounding the region. Although many questioned the reliability of his observations, Thomas was convinced that there was a pattern waiting to be deciphered, a hidden logic behind the seemingly random events. The local church became a focal point for discussions about what should be done regarding Evelyn. The pastor, who had been cautious in his previous approaches, now spoke with more urgency about the need for action. He did not propose violence or direct confrontation, but suggested that the community needed to unite in vigilance and prayer. His words resonated with some, while others saw them as dangerous incitement that could lead to injustice. The congregation was divided, reflecting the broader fractures that ran throughout the community. Meanwhile, visitors to Evelyn's property did not diminish. If anything, they increased in frequency and diversity. People came from distant counties, some traveling for days just to spend a few hours in her presence. What exactly happened during these visits remained shrouded in mystery, protected by the same pact of silence that had always characterized those who sought Evelyn's services. But changes were noticeable in those who returned, subtle transformations in posture, expression, and manner of speaking that did not go unnoticed by attentive observers. Tension in the region continued to grow, like a storm slowly brewing on the horizon. Everyone sensed that something was about to happen, an event that would define Evelyn Carter's fate, and by extension, the character of the community itself. The choices made in the following months would reverberate for generations, shaping not only the present, but also how that period would be remembered and interpreted in the future. And at the center of it all, impassive and enigmatic, Evelyn continued her work, as if she already knew exactly how it would all end. Summer brought with it an oppressive heat that seemed to suck the energy from everything and everyone. The Appalachian Mountains, normally cooled by breezes from the heights, remained suffocated under a dense, still air. Plants withered in the fields, streams dwindled to silvery threads snaking between exposed rocks, and people moved with the lethargy of those walking through thick water. It was as if nature itself were holding its breath, awaiting something indefinable. At that time, Evelyn Carter's property presented a stark contrast to the rest of the region. While the surrounding gardens withered under the relentless sun, hers flourished with unnatural vigor. The plants she cultivated seemed immune to drought, their leaves maintaining a deep, bright green that caught the eye of anyone passing by on the nearby road. This phenomenon did not go unnoticed. further fueling speculation about the methods she employed in her work. It was during these warm months that a woman named Margaret Holloway arrived in the region. She came from somewhere in the east, carrying only a small suitcase and an air of quiet determination. Margaret rented a room in a modest boarding house in the center of the county and, from the first day, made clear her interest in meeting Evelyn Carter. Her presence aroused immediate curiosity, as solo travelers were uncommon, especially women who demonstrated such independence and purpose. Margaret was different from the people in the region. Her way of dressing, her manner of speaking, everything about her indicated an urban origin and formal education. She asked direct questions about Evelyn, said without the embarrassment or hesitation that characterized the locals when the subject came up. She showed neither fear nor reverence, only an intellectual curiosity that many found disconcerting. Some speculated that she was some kind of investigator, while others imagined that perhaps she was a distant relative of Evelyn, come to confront her about some unresolved family matter. When Margaret finally visited Evelyn's property, she stayed there for hours. The nearest neighbors, who had grown accustomed to observing the flow of visitors, noticed that this visit was different. There was none of the furtive quality that characterized most encounters. The two women were seen conversing in the front garden, their voices occasionally rising in animated discussion, though specific words could not be distinguished from a distance. There was a quality of intellectual debate in that interaction, something rarely witnessed on that property. After that first encounter, Margaret became a frequent visitor. She and Evelyn spent long periods together, sometimes walking through the surrounding forest, other times working in the gardens or locked inside the main house. This new dynamic subtly altered the balance of power in the region. Evelyn, who had always operated in calculated isolation, now had a visible ally, someone who didn't hide behind nighttime visits or public denials. It was an open challenge to the social norms that had kept Evelyn's activities in a gray area of reluctant tolerance. Thomas Whitmore intensified his observations. His notebook now contained page after page of notes on Margaret's movements, her interactions with Evelyn, and the changes he perceived on the property since her arrival. He was convinced that Margaret represented an escalation, a new chapter in the mystery that could reveal long-hidden truths. His theories became more elaborate, connecting seemingly unrelated events into a complex narrative that few could fully follow. The church pastor seized the opportunity to renew his warnings about spiritual vigilance. In his sermons, he spoke of external influences that corrupted established communities, of knowledge that seemed promising but carried seeds of destruction. His metaphors were too transparent to ignore, and the congregation listened with expressions ranging from fervent approval to visible discomfort. The church, which should have been a space of unity, had become an arena where the divisions within the community were exposed and amplified. Margaret, seemingly unaware or indifferent to the reactions she was causing, continued her routine. She explored the region during the mornings, talking to local residents, asking questions about the county's history, about old families, about local traditions and beliefs. Her conversations were polite but persistent, and many found themselves revealing information they would normally keep to themselves. There was something in her approach that disarmed habitual defenses, a combination of genuine interest and absence of judgment that invited confidence. Margaret spent her afternoons tending to Evelyn's property. The two women could be seen working together in the gardens, their heads bent over specific plants, discussing properties and applications in low but lively voices. Occasionally, laughter would escape the space, a sound so unusual coming from that property that it would make people stop and look in surprise. It was as if Margaret had brought a lightness that had long been absent from Evelyn's life, a possibility of normalcy that challenged the somber narrative built around her. But not everything was light. During the nights, light still danced in the windows of Evelyn's house, and now there were two silhouettes instead of one. The chants that occasionally echoed through the valleys gained new complexity, harmonies that suggested coordinated and rehearsed practices. The strange objects in the forest multiplied, becoming more elaborate in their construction and arrangement. It was as if Margaret's arrival had released something that had previously been contained, amplifying phenomena that were already disturbing. Summer wore on, relentless and stifling, and with it grew the feeling that significant events were approaching. The community watched, torn between fascination and apprehension, as Margaret and Evelyn continued their mysterious work. Some began to wonder if Margaret's arrival had been a coincidence or part of a larger plan, a piece in a game whose rules no one but the two women fully understood. The autumn of 1906 painted the mountains with shades of amber and crimson, transforming the landscape into a mosaic of colors that contrasted dramatically with the tense atmosphere that hung over the county. Leaves fell in silent cascades, covering the paths with crisp carpets that crackled under the feet of travelers. The air had acquired that crystalline quality typical of the season, where sounds traveled long distances, and each breath carried the scent of wood and damp earth. Margaret Holloway had become a permanent part of the local landscape, her presence no longer causing the same initial stir. She and Evelyn had developed a routine that the community had learned to accept, albeit with reservations. The two women were seen together regularly, walking along forest trails, visiting the small county market, occasionally participating in community events with a naturalness that defied expectations. It was as if they were deliberately normalizing their association, forcing the community to recognize them as an integral part of local life. During this period, something interesting began to happen. Some women from the region, particularly the younger and more independent ones, began to visit Evelyn's property openly during the day, without the secrecy that had always characterized such visits. They went in small groups, spent hours talking with Evelyn and Margaret, and returned with thoughtful expressions and a slightly altered posture. There was nothing obviously subversive about these meetings, but they represented a subtle shift in the established social dynamics. These women began asking questions they hadn't asked before. They questioned traditions they had always accepted without thinking, challenged expectations that seemed immutable, and expressed ambitions they had kept hidden until then. It wasn't a revolution, but rather a gradual awakening, an expansion of possibilities that disturbed those invested in maintaining the status quo. The husbands, fathers, and brothers of these women watched with growing discomfort, uncertain how to respond to changes that were too subtle to confront directly, but too significant to ignore. Thomas Whitmore, in his meticulous observations, noticed this emerging pattern. His notebook now contained not only records of strange events, but also analyses of the social changes he saw unfolding. He tried to connect everything into a coherent narrative, searching for the thread that linked the inexplicable phenomena of the forest to the subtle transformations in people's attitudes. In his mind, everything was related, part of a larger influence emanating from Evelyn Carter's property. The church pastor reacted to these changes with increasingly fervent sermons. He spoke of the importance of established order, of the dangers of intellectual arrogance, of how knowledge without spiritual wisdom led to perdition. His words resonated with a considerable portion of the congregation, but also alienated others who saw in his pronouncements an attempt to maintain control through fear. The church, which had always been a pillar of community unity, had become a mirror of the deepest divisions fracturing the county. Evelyn and Margaret seemed indifferent to these reactions. They continued their work, which now included creating a kind of informal library in one of the structures attached to the main house. Women from the region were invited to bring books, manuscripts, inherited recipe books, any written record they considered valuable. The collection grew rapidly, transforming that space into a repository of female knowledge that had been dispersed and devalued over generations. It was a silent but powerful affirmation of the value of perspectives that had traditionally been marginalized. The meetings on the property took on a more formal structure. There were set times, specific topics for discussion, and an organization that suggested a long-term purpose. The women who participated began to form a network of mutual support, exchanging knowledge about natural healing, home economics, and strategies for navigating social constraints. There was nothing explicitly radical about these exchanges, but the mere existence of a space where women gathered independently of male supervision was in itself a significant transgression. Evelyn's gardens continued to flourish with that inexplicable vigor, even as autumn progressed and other plants went dormant. This resistance to obvious natural laws fueled continuous speculation, but now there was a group of women who had learned Evelyn's methods, who understood the principles behind that seemingly supernatural success. Knowledge was being shared, multiplied, decentralized. What was once Evelyn's exclusive secret was becoming the collective heritage of a growing group. Margaret meticulously recorded everything in her own notebooks. She documented not only cultivation techniques and medicine preparation, but also oral histories of the women who visited the property, family narratives that would otherwise be lost, and perspectives on historical events that differed from official versions. Her work had archival quality, a deliberate attempt to preserve voices that were not normally recorded for posterity. There was an implicit recognition that they were creating something important, something that transcended their individual lives. The nights still brought their peculiar phenomena. The lights continued to dance. Strange sounds echoed through the valleys. Mysterious structures appeared in the forest. But now there were more witnesses to these events, more people who could confirm that they were not products of imagination or mass hysteria. The mystery remained, but it was becoming more democratized, less concentrated on the solitary figure of Evelyn Carter. It was a subtle but profound transformation in the nature of the enigma that had defined that region. Autumn was inexorably drawing towards winter, and with it grew the feeling that irreversible changes were underway. The community could no longer ignore or marginalize what was happening on Evelyn's property. The phenomenon had grown beyond the limits of control, becoming a movement with its own momentum. And at the center of it all, Evelyn and Margaret continued their work, aware that they were planting seeds whose fruits would only be harvested in future generations. Winter returned with renewed force, bringing with it blizzards that isolated the county for days on end. The world was reduced to the immaculate white of the snow and the grey of the low clouds that seemed to touch the mountain peaks. It was a period of forced introspection, where each family remained confined to their homes, leaving only to gather firewood or tend to animals. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional howl of the wind through the valleys. At Evelyn Carter's property, however, activity did not diminish. The annex structures had been prepared to house visitors for extended periods, and several women from the region spent entire days there, protected from the harsh cold, while participating in studies and discussions that stretched through the long winter nights. Smoke rose constantly from the chimneys, indicating warmth and life in contrast to the frozen world around them. That space had become a refuge not only physically, but also intellectually and emotionally. Margaret Holloway had fully settled into local life, though she always retained a certain outsider quality that distinguished her from the region's natives. During that winter, she began offering reading and writing lessons to the women who visited the property. Many of them had had limited or no education, their intellectual capacities never having been properly cultivated. Margaret changed that with methodical patience, transforming illiterate women into readers, observers into chroniclers of their own lives. The process was transformative in ways that went beyond simply acquiring skills. When a woman learned to read, she gained access to entire worlds of knowledge and perspective that were previously closed off. When she learned to write, she gained a permanent voice, the ability to record her thoughts and experiences in a way that would survive beyond her individual memory. These were profound changes that fundamentally altered these women's relationship with the world around them and with their own sense of possibility. Evelyn, for her part, continued teaching her particular arts. She shared knowledge about plants that had been passed down through generations, but she also constantly experimented, cross-breeding varieties, testing new applications, and documenting results with a rigor that rivaled any formal scientific method. Her indoor gardens, protected in makeshift greenhouses, flourished even in the dead of winter, producing specimens that defied the season. The women who learned from her took this knowledge to their own properties, beginning to apply the methods to their own crops. During the afternoons, as the dim winter light began to fade, the women gathered on the property shared stories. These were narratives passed down orally through generations, tales of ancestors who had navigated difficult circumstances with ingenuity and courage. Margaret meticulously recorded everything, recognizing the value of these stories not only as entertainment, but as a repository of practical wisdom and emotional resilience. Each story revealed survival strategies, subtle forms of resistance, methods of maintaining dignity in conditions that denied it. Thomas Whitmore, confined like everyone else by the deep snow, used the time to organize his accumulated observations. He created categories, identified patterns, and constructed increasingly elaborate theories about what he believed he was witnessing. His notebook had become a multi-volume file, an obsessive archive of every detail he considered relevant. He was convinced he had discovered something significant, a conspiracy or movement operating beneath the surface of ordinary life. His conclusions, however, revealed more about his own fears and prejudices than about the reality he was trying to document. The pastor used Sundays, when the community gathered at church regardless of the weather, to intensify his warning messages. He spoke of wolves in sheep's clothing, of knowledge that seemed benevolent, but carried seeds of destruction, of the importance of upholding time-tested traditions against dangerous innovations. His words were calibrated to resonate with the deepest fears of his congregation, and he knew exactly which strings to strike to provoke intense emotional reactions. The church had become an arena of psychological warfare, where battles for the soul of the community were fought through biblical metaphors and appeals to divine authority. But not everyone in the congregation was receptive to these messages. A growing group of women, those who had experienced the meetings at Evelyn's property, began to question the pastor's interpretations. They didn't challenge him openly. That would be unacceptable transgression, but their expressions during the sermons revealed growing skepticism. Some began to miss services, claiming illness or difficulties with the snow, even though everyone knew they could cross worse blizzards to reach Evelyn's property. This silent desertion was, in itself, a powerful form of resistance. During that winter, something remarkable happened on the property. The women who gathered there began producing a collective manuscript, a compilation of knowledge they had accumulated over months of study and exchange. The document included farming techniques, medicinal recipes, strategies for household economy, but also reflections on philosophy, observations on human nature, and analyses of social structures. It was an ambitious work, an attempt to create a permanent record of feminine wisdom that was traditionally lost or dismissed as trivial. Margaret oversaw the organization of the manuscript, ensuring that different voices were represented and that the diversity of perspectives was preserved. She insisted that each contributor sign their sections, an acknowledgement of authorship that was rare for women of that time and region. The act of signing their names on a formal document, of claiming ownership over their words and ideas, was a transformative experience for many of these women. For the first time, they saw their thoughts treated as worthy of preservation and study. Evelyn contributed sections on her cultivation techniques, but also more philosophical reflections on the relationship between humans and nature, on cycles of growth and dormancy that applied to both plants and social movements. Her words revealed an intellectual depth that many in the community had not recognized, having categorized her only as a practitioner of obscure arts. The manuscript was revealing that she was a sophisticated thinker, someone who had developed complex systems of knowledge through decades of careful observation and experimentation. The nights still brought their peculiar phenomena, but now there was a growing understanding of their nature. The dancing lights were experiments with different types of lighting, attempts to create more efficient light sources, less dependent on scarce resources. The echoing sounds were musical practices, explorations of vocal harmonies rooted in ancient traditions, but being reinterpreted and expanded. The structures in the forest were markers, guidance systems for those who needed to navigate through the deep snow to reach the property. The mystery was being demystified, but this did not diminish its importance, only change its nature. As winter progressed, it became clear that something fundamental had changed in the county. The women who attended the meetings at Evelyn's property were no longer the same as they had been months before. They had discovered abilities they didn't know they possessed, had developed confidence in their own judgment, and had formed support networks that transcended traditional family structures. These changes were irreversible, and their implications would extend far beyond that particular winter. Evelyn Carter's property had become more than just an individual residence. It was now a learning center, a space for experimentation, a refuge for those seeking something different from what traditional society offered. And while the snow continued to fall, covering everything with its white blanket, within those heated structures, a different future was being imagined and built, word by word, skill by skill, connection by connection. The spring of 1907 burst across the mountains with surprising vigor, as if nature itself were celebrating some secret awakening. Wildflowers carpeted the valleys in waves of color that followed week after week, transforming the landscape into a living, ever-changing tapestry. Streams flowed swiftly with the thaw, their crystal-clear waters reflecting the intense blue sky that had finally driven away the heavy winter clouds. The air carried fragrances of renewal, that particular scent of damp earth and new growth that promised endless possibilities. On Evelyn Carter's property, the gardens responded to the season with an explosion of life that surpassed even previous years. Plants that had been grown during the winter in makeshift greenhouses were transplanted to outdoor flower beds, where they established themselves with remarkable ease. The women who had learned Evelyn's techniques during the cold months now applied them to their own land, and the results began to appear on properties scattered throughout the county. It was a silent but visible transformation, a change that could not be denied or ignored. Margaret Holloway dedicated that spring to expanding her classes beyond Evelyn's estate. She began visiting individual farms, borrowing books and writing materials, offering personalized instruction to women who could not leave their domestic responsibilities to attend the regular meetings. Her presence on these estates elicited varied reactions from the men of the families. Some received her with cautious courtesy, recognizing the value of education, even when they distrusted her intentions. Others were openly hostile, seeing her influence as a threat to the established order of their homes. During this period, the collective manuscript that had been begun in the winter was completed. The document had dozens of pages, each filled with careful calligraphy and detailed illustrations. It represented months of collaborative work, a synthesis of knowledge that had been scattered and undervalued for generations. The women who had contributed to its creation organized a modest ceremony to celebrate its completion, a moment of recognition of what they had achieved together. There was nothing grand about the ceremony, just a circle of women passing the manuscript from hand to hand, each reading aloud sections they had written or that had particular significance. Thomas Whitmore, observing these activities from his self-appointed position as a community watchdog, concluded that he needed to act. His observation notebooks had become evidence in his mind of a dangerous pattern threatening the social fabric of the county. He began sharing his findings with other men in the community, organizing informal meetings where he presented his theories and argued for the need for intervention. His words found a receptive audience among those who felt threatened by the changes they observed in their wives, daughters, and sisters. The church pastor tacitly allied himself with Thomas, though he publicly distanced himself from his more extreme activities. In his sermons, he continued to warn of spiritual dangers, but now his messages had a sharper edge, a sense of urgency that revealed growing anxiety. He perceived that he was losing influence over a significant segment of his congregation, and this loss of power deeply disturbed him. The church, which had always been the unquestionable center of community life, was being challenged by an alternative center of authority and knowledge. Evelyn and Margaret were not naive about the forces mobilizing against them. They could feel the growing tension, the hostile stares that followed them when they visited the market, the conversations that abruptly ceased when they approached, but they continued their work with calm determination. Refusing to be intimidated or to moderate their activities, there was a quality of inevitability in their posture, as if they knew confrontation was imminent and had decided to face it on their own terms. The meetings on the property continued, but now with heightened awareness of the risks involved. The women who participated did so knowing they were challenging powerful expectations, risking social disapproval and potentially more serious consequences. But they kept coming, drawn by the promise of something they had found in that space, a sense of possibility and agency that was rare in their daily lives. Fear wasn't enough to stop them, not when they had experienced an alternative that seemed so vital and real. On a particularly beautiful spring afternoon, a group of men led by Thomas appeared on Evelyn's property. They did not come with explicit violence, but their presence was intimidating, deliberately designed to convey threat. Thomas spoke as the group's spokesperson, presenting a list of demands that included a cessation of the meetings, Margaret's expulsion from the county, and a public commitment from Evelyn to limit her activities to traditional and accepted medical practices. His voice was firm, but there was an underlying tremor that revealed nervousness about what they were doing. Evelyn listened in silence, her face revealing no emotion. When Thomas finished, she simply asked on what authority they made these demands. The question was simple, but it cut to the heart of the matter. They had no legal authority, no official mandate, only the conviction that traditional order should be preserved. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, filled only by birdsong and the whisper of the wind through the trees. Finally, without waiting for an answer they knew wouldn't come, the men withdrew, but the threat implicit in their visit remained heavy in the air. Margaret suggested that perhaps it was time to consider strategic moderation, a temporary reduction in activities until tensions subsided, but Evelyn refused, arguing that giving in to intimidation would only encourage more extreme demands. The two women debated the issue at length, weighing risks against principles, security against integrity. Finally, they decided to continue, but with increased preparations for possible future confrontations. They began to document everything more carefully, creating records that could serve as legal protection if necessary. The following weeks were marked by palpable tension. The community was divided in ways that could no longer be ignored or denied. Families were fractured by disagreements over activities on Evelyn's property. Old friendships were tested, alliances reshaped. The county, which had always maintained an appearance of cohesion despite internal differences, now openly displayed its divisions. It was a time of choices, where neutrality became increasingly unsustainable, and each person was forced to decide where they stood. Spring was inexorably advancing towards summer, and with it grew the feeling that some kind of resolution was inevitable. The conflicting forces were on a collision course, and everyone felt that when they finally met, the impact would shape the county's future in ways no one could fully predict. At the center of it all, impassive but vigilant, Evelyn Carter continued her work, refusing to be moved, prepared to face whatever came with the same quiet determination that had always characterized her existence in those mountains. Summer brought with it a heat that seemed to intensify not only the temperature, but also the emotions that simmered in the county. The days stretched long and bright, the sun lingering in the sky late into the night, as if reluctant to allow darkness to cover the unfolding events. The earth was dry, cracking under the weight of weeks without significant rain, and there was an oppressive quality in the air that made each breath feel heavy, laden with anticipation. During that period, Evelyn Carter's property became a focal point of attention in ways that transcended previous controversies. The women who attended her meetings had begun to apply their acquired knowledge in increasingly visible and impactful ways. Gardens that had previously yielded modest harvests now flourished abundantly, providing not only sustenance for individual families, but also surpluses that could be marketed. This newfound prosperity did not go unnoticed, and it created a complex dynamic of envy, admiration, and resentment among those observing from the outside. Margaret Holloway expanded her educational activities even further, establishing regular schedules at different properties around the county. She carried with her not only books and writing materials, but also the collective manuscript that had been finalized in the spring, using it as a text for study and inspiration. The women learning to read began with that document, seeing their own experiences and knowledge reflected in the pages, recognizing that their lives and wisdom were worthy of recording and study. It was a profoundly validating experience that transformed not only skills, but identities. The network of women that had formed around Evelyn and Margaret's activities developed its own structure and methods of communication. They established a system of signals and messengers to quickly share information throughout the county, announcing meeting opportunities or warning of potential dangers. It was an impressive organization, especially considering that many of these women had limited mobility and responsibilities that restricted their free time. But they found ways to contribute, each according to her abilities and circumstances. Thomas Whitmore and his allies, observing this growing organization, intensified their own efforts. They began documenting not only activities on Evelyn's property, but also the movements of the women who visited her, attempting to map the full extent of the network that had formed. Their notebooks filled with diagrams and lists, attempts to visualize connections and identify leaders beyond the obvious figures of Evelyn and Margaret. There was an obsessive quality to their work, a mixture of genuine vigilance with a morbid fascination with what they were witnessing. The church pastor decided to confront the situation more directly. He organized a series of special community meetings open to all county residents, where issues of morality and social order could be discussed publicly. His ostensible goal was to promote dialogue and understanding, but his methods revealed an intention to isolate and marginalize those he saw as challenging the established order. The meetings quickly became arenas of heated debate, where veiled accusations and passionate defenses were exchanged in language that attempted to sound civil but barely concealed deep hostilities. During one of these meetings, one of the women who attended Evelyn's meetings stood up and spoke publicly about what she had experienced. Her name was Sarah, and she was known in the community as a reserved person who respected conventions. Her decision to speak was, therefore, particularly impactful. Sarah described how the knowledge she had acquired had transformed her ability to provide for her family, how the education she had received from Margaret had opened up entire worlds of understanding, how the community of women she had found offered support she had never known she needed. Her words were simple and direct, but they carried the weight of lived experience that was difficult to dispute. Sarah's testimony encouraged other women to speak up. One by one, they rose and shared their stories, creating a chorus of voices that revealed the breadth and depth of the impact Evelyn and Margaret's activities had had. These were not accounts of manipulation or corruption, but of empowerment and discovery, of realized capabilities and enriched lives. The men present listened with expressions ranging from genuine surprise to evident discomfort, confronted with perspectives on their own wives and daughters that they may never have fully considered. But not everyone was convinced. Thomas stood up and presented his own observations, reading passages from his notebooks that described events he interpreted as sinister. He spoke of nighttime meetings, of practices that defied established conventions, of social changes he saw as threats to community stability. His words were carefully chosen to provoke fear, and they resonated with some, particularly those who felt threatened by the changes they observed in their own families. The meeting ended without a clear resolution, but it had exposed the depth of the divisions that fractured the county. People left the church that night in separate groups, no longer a unified community, but distinct factions with incompatible visions of the future they desired. Conversations continued in individual homes, in taverns, in fields where men worked side by side, but no longer trusted each other in the same way. The social cohesion that had held the county together through decades was disintegrating, and no one knew how or if it could be restored. Evelyn and Margaret responded to these tensions by increasing their transparency. They began inviting anyone interested to visit the property at specific times, offering tours of the gardens and detailed explanations of their methods. The intention was to demystify their activities, to show that nothing sinister or dangerous was happening, only serious work of education and cultivation. Some accepted the invitation and left with altered impressions, recognizing that their suspicions had been unfounded. Others refused, preferring to keep their theories untested rather than risk having them challenged by contradictory evidence. During this period, something unexpected happened. Several women from neighboring counties began to appear, having heard about the activities on Evelyn's property through communication networks that extended beyond local borders. They had been seeking similar knowledge, wanting to establish parallel initiatives in their own regions. Margaret worked with these visitors, sharing methods and materials, helping them develop plans adapted to their specific circumstances. What had begun as a local phenomenon was expanding, creating regional connections that could sustain the movement even if local efforts were suppressed. Evelyn's gardens continued to thrive despite the drought affecting the region. This continued success was both a blessing and a curse, providing tangible evidence of the effectiveness of her methods, but also fueling speculation about supernatural means. She tried to explain her techniques, detailing the principles of water conservation, the choice of appropriate species, and careful soil preparation. But for some, natural explanations were less satisfactory than attributions of mysterious powers. The extraordinary was easier to accept than the ordinary executed with exceptional mastery. As summer progressed, it became clear that the situation was reaching a critical point. Tensions could not continue to escalate indefinitely without some form of resolution. Everyone felt it, the weight of inevitability pressing down on the community like the heavy atmosphere before a storm. Conversations that were once heated but civil began to take on the edge of genuine hostility. Friendships that had survived previous disagreements began to break down definitively. Families were forced to choose sides in disputes that went beyond personal preferences to questions of fundamental values and worldviews. Margaret began to express concerns about physical safety. She observed how the hostile stares had become more intense, how whispered comments were now uttered at audible volumes, intended to intimidate. Evelyn listened to these concerns seriously, but maintained her refusal to be driven by fear. She had lived in those mountains for decades, had faced challenges before, and believed that giving in to intimidation would be a betrayal of everything she had built. The two women discussed protection strategies, ways to ensure that the work they had begun could continue even if they themselves were prevented from proceeding. Summer seemed endless, each day merging into the next in a succession of oppressive heat and mounting tension. The skies remained clear, with no promise of rain to break the drought or refresh the heavy air. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. And amidst all this, life went on. People going about their daily tasks, planting and harvesting, caring for families, maintaining a semblance of normalcy, even as everyone felt that something fundamental was about to change in ways that could no longer be reversed. Autumn arrived abruptly that year, bringing with it winds that swept across the mountains with unusual force. The leaves changed color almost overnight, transforming the valleys into seas of gold and crimson that rippled under constant gusts. There was something unsettling about the beauty of that season, as if nature were offering one last display of splendor before some inevitable end. The air carried the scent of change, that specific fragrance of decay and preparation that marked the transition to winter. At Evelyn Carter's property, preparations for the cold months had begun earlier than usual. Stoves were reinforced, supplies stockpiled, firewood chopped and piled in quantities that suggested an expectation of a long siege. Margaret worked alongside Evelyn with an efficiency born of years of collaboration, even though only a few years had passed since her arrival. The two women had developed a work rhythm that dispensed with unnecessary words, each anticipating the other's needs with precision bordering on intuition. The women who formed the core of the network established around the property began taking steps to protect the knowledge they had accumulated. Copies of the collective manuscript were meticulously made, each hidden in a different location, ensuring that even if the original were destroyed, the contents would survive. It was a grim acknowledgement that what they had created was under real threat, that forces mobilized against them might try to erase not only their present activities, but also the record of their achievements. Sarah, the woman who had spoken publicly during the community meeting months earlier, assumed a leadership role among the network participants. She organized meetings on her own property, creating an alternative center of activity that distributed risk and ensured the movement didn't depend solely on Evelyn's property. Her home became a refuge for women who needed a safe space to study or discuss ideas away from the constant scrutiny that now characterized life in the county. Sarah demonstrated remarkable courage, knowing her actions exposed her to criticism and potential reprisals, yet maintaining her commitment to what she believed was right. Thomas Whitmore and his allies, observing this decentralization of activities, grew frustrated with the increasing difficulty of monitoring and controlling what they perceived as a threat. Their surveillance efforts had become more elaborate, but also more desperate, revealing that they were fighting a phenomenon that had grown beyond their capacity to contain. The meetings they organized became more frequent and their discussions more heated, but they lacked a coherent strategy beyond vague expressions about the need to restore traditional order. The church pastor found himself in an increasingly difficult position. He had staked his moral authority on the campaign against Evelyn and her activities, but the results did not meet his expectations. His congregation had visibly dwindled, with entire families choosing to stay home on Sundays or finding other forms of spiritual expression that did not require submission to his interpretations. The church, which had always been a central and unquestionable institution in community life, was now competing for relevance and influence in ways he had never imagined possible. During that fall, a series of events occurred that tested the community's resilience in unexpected ways. A severe respiratory illness began to spread through the county, particularly affecting those with weaker constitutions. The conventional medicine available in the region had limited resources to treat the illness, and many families found themselves desperate for any form of relief. It was in this context that the knowledge developed and shared through the women's network proved its value in undeniable ways. Evelyn and the women who had learned her techniques prepared remedies that offered significant relief to the sick. They visited homes around the county, bringing not only medicine, but also knowledge about care and prevention. Their work was tireless, driven by a sense of responsibility that transcended the political and social divisions that had fractured the community. Even families who had been vocally critical of their activities found themselves accepting their help when members fell ill, creating uncomfortable cognitive dissonance for those who had demonized these same women just weeks before. The health crisis forced many in the county to reassess their positions. It was difficult to maintain abstract hostility toward people who had saved the lives of loved ones through knowledge and compassion. Simplistic narratives about dangerous influences and suspicious practices collapsed in the face of concrete evidence of tangible benefit. Not that everyone changed their minds, some maintained their suspicions even while accepting help, but the absolute certainties that had characterized the conflict began to give way to more complex ambiguities. Margaret used this period to meticulously document the treatments administered and their results. She recognized that they were creating a record that could be valuable not only to the local community, but to a broader medical understanding. Her training and perspective allowed her to contextualize Evelyn's practical knowledge within frameworks that could be communicated and validated through more formal methods. It was a work of translation between different systems of knowledge, bridging traditional wisdom and systematic inquiry. The nights grew longer, and with them came deeper reflections on what had transpired during those tumultuous years. Conversations around firesides throughout the county revolved around questions that had no easy answers. How should community balance tradition and change? What was the proper role of authority versus individual autonomy? How could different forms of knowledge be valued and integrated? These were not abstract questions, but urgent ones, with real implications for how people lived their daily lives. Evelyn, in rare moments of personal conversation with Margaret, reflected on the journey they had traveled together. She expressed surprise at the extent of what they had achieved, acknowledging that she alone would never have reached such an impact. Margaret's arrival had catalyzed transformations that were latent but needed external energy to manifest. The two women recognized that they were, in many ways, instruments of greater forces, responding to needs and possibilities that existed independently of their individual actions. The network of women continued to expand, now including participants from multiple counties. Correspondence was exchanged regularly, sharing successes and challenges, offering mutual support across distances that would otherwise be isolating. Something was emerging that could be described as a movement, although no one explicitly used that term. It was more organic and less structured than organized movements, but no less real in its impact and potential for lasting transformation. Faced with the resilience and expansion of what he was trying to combat, Thomas Whitmore began to question his own efforts. His notebooks, which once represented certainty and purpose, now seemed like a record of unproductive obsession. He observed how the community had changed, recognizing that many of these changes were, objectively, improvements in people's quality of life. His moral certainty was being eroded by complexities that didn't fit into his simple categories of right and wrong. The pastor faced a similar crisis. He had built his authority on specific interpretations of morality and divine order, but these interpretations were being challenged by realities he could not deny. Women whose lives had been positively transformed did not seem to be on paths to perdition. Knowledge he had categorized as dangerous was saving lives. The dissonance between his doctrines and observable evidence created psychological tension that he struggled to resolve. As autumn progressed toward winter, the atmosphere in the county had shifted from impending confrontation to something more akin to exhaustion. People were tired of conflict, of living in a constant state of tension. There was a growing desire for resolution, for finding ways to coexist even when complete agreement was impossible. It wasn't peace in the sense of perfect harmony, but a pragmatic recognition that mutual destruction served no one's interests. Evelyn Carter's property remained, as it always had been, a focal point of activity and meaning that transcended its modest physical appearance. The structures she and Margaret had built over the years represented more than just buildings. They were manifestations of different possibilities, spaces where alternative rules could be explored and tested. And as winter approached once more, bringing with it familiar chill and a need to turn inward, there was a sense that something fundamental had been established, something that would outlive individuals and persist through generations. The women who had participated in this journey carried with them transformations that could not be undone. They had discovered abilities, formed connections, and developed understandings that permanently altered their relationships with themselves and with the world. These changes would be transmitted through words and actions to those who came after, creating a legacy that would extend far beyond those specific years in the mountains of Virginia. And in this persistence, in this refusal to be erased or forgotten, lay the true victory of what they had built together. Winter once again enveloped the Appalachian Mountains in its silent cloak, bringing with it a quietude unlike any before. The snow fell gently, covering everything with layers that transformed the landscape into a blank canvas, as if nature were offering an opportunity for a fresh start. The cold was intense, but not cruel. inviting reflection and the necessary quietude after a time of so much movement and transformation. On Evelyn Carter's property, life continued at its established rhythm. The greenhouses kept their indoor gardens flourishing, even while the outside world slept, a persistent symbol that there were ways to maintain life and growth, even in the most adverse conditions. Margaret and Evelyn worked side by side, their routines now so integrated that they seemed natural extensions of one another. There was peace in that space, her sense of purpose fulfilled even knowing that the work was never truly complete. The women of the region had learned to navigate the complexities of their transformed lives. They found a balance between social expectations and self-determination, between valued traditions and necessary innovations. There was no perfect solution, only continuous adjustments and negotiations that required wisdom and patience, but they had gained something precious in that process, awareness of their own capabilities and the right to claim space for their voices and visions. The county, in turn, had reached a sort of undeclared truce. The divisions didn't magically disappear, but people learned to coexist with their differences. Conversations that once ended in confrontations now flowed with more care, a tacit recognition that community meant embracing a multiplicity of perspectives. It was maturation forced by circumstances, but maturation nonetheless. Thomas Whitmore eventually put away his notebooks, realizing that his obsessive vigilance had neither prevented the changes he feared nor revealed the conspiracies he imagined. He remained skeptical about many things, but his skepticism had lost the feverish urgency that had consumed him. He had learned, perhaps reluctantly, that not everything he didn't understand was necessarily threatening. The church pastor found ways to reframe his messages, discovering that spirituality could be expressed through questions as much as through certainties. His congregation remained smaller than before, but those who continued to come sought something deeper than validation of preconceptions. He had learned a humbling lesson about the limits of institutional authority when confronted with lived experiences that contradicted established doctrines. Sarah and other leaders in the Women's Network continued their work, now with less drama but no less determination. They had understood that lasting change rarely came from dramatic confrontations, but from everyday persistence, from small actions repeated over time that gradually altered social landscapes. It was less visible work, but no less important. The gardens around the county would bloom again when spring arrived, benefiting from techniques that were now widely shared. Knowledge that had been concentrated in a few hands now circulated freely, adapting to different contexts and needs. It was a democratization of wisdom that promised benefits that would extend far beyond that specific place and time. Margaret would continue documenting, her pages filling with observations and reflections that perhaps one day would serve purposes she could not yet fully imagine. She understood that she was creating an archive of a particular moment, a testament to the possibilities that emerged when people dared to question imposed limits and explore alternatives. Evelyn, for her part, remained as she had always been, enigmatic and serene, her figure around whom so many stories had crystallized. She would continue her work as long as she had the strength to do so, knowing that she had planted seeds that would grow far beyond her individual life. There was satisfaction in that knowledge, a feeling of having contributed to something greater than herself. The Appalachian Mountains would hold these stories in their silent folds, impassive witnesses to human dramas unfolding against their timeless majesty, and perhaps, on quiet nights when the wind blew through the valleys, one could still hear echoes of those times, whispers of transformations that changed a community in ways that would never be completely undone. This journey through the shadows and mysteries of the Appalachians reminds us that the most intriguing stories are those that explore the complexity of human nature. If you enjoyed this narrative, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment, sharing what impacted you most in this story. Until the next journey through the forgotten mysteries of the past.